The Chicago sunrise caught the blue glass of Whitlock Pay. Inside, a new chief executive officer was about to make the worst decision of her career. Serafina Whitlock, 28, hazel hair pulled neat at her shoulders, walked into a control room full of red alerts and saw a black man asleep at his desk. She did not ask his name. She did not ask what the alarms meant. She fired him in front of everyone. He stood up, met her eyes, and said one sentence before walking out. Do not restart the system. 3 hours later, $420 million began drifting beyond reach. Whitlock Pay was a payment processing firm in the heart of Chicago. The kind of business almost nobody outside finance ever thought about. Even though their money passed through it every day, the company moved payroll for hundreds of small businesses, cleared invoices for hospitals and contractors, and protected the kind of data that, if lost, could ruin people who had never heard the company's name. From the outside, the offices looked spotless, the lobby polished to the soft reflection of a museum floor. From the inside, the systems that kept everything running had been patched together over many years, layer upon layer, until only a handful of engineers truly understood how the whole thing fit together. 2 acquisitions had folded their own legacy code into the foundation. 3 different chief technology officers had each left their habits behind. What remained was a living thing that nobody dared to fully redesign because nobody fully knew what would break if they tried. The man who understood it best was Carter Hayes. He was 29 years old, tall, broad-shouldered, a black American with close-cropped hair and dark brown eyes that always looked a little tired. He was not the kind of engineer who gave loud presentations. He did not network. He did not push for promotion. He simply sat at his desk and listened to the system the way an old mechanic listens to an engine. He had joined Whitlock Pay 7 years earlier, fresh out of a state engineering program in Illinois, with 2 student loans and a quiet determination to do good work. He had stayed through all of it, quietly making notes, quietly fixing things he was never officially asked to fix. The other engineers on the floor had a private name for the kind of work he did. They called it ghost maintenance, because nobody saw it happening until the moment it was no longer there. In those 7 years, his technical reviews had been the highest on the floor more often than not. And in those same 7 years, he had been passed over for promotion 4 separate times. The first time he had been told the new role required someone with more visibility. The second time, the slot went to a younger engineer who had been at the company 11 months. The third and fourth times, he had stopped reading the explanations. There was a quieter pattern, too, that nobody put in writing. 2 different managers, on their first day in the building, had walked past Carter's desk and asked him where the senior engineer sat. Carter had pointed at his own chair both times and watched the small adjustment travel across the manager's face. He had never mentioned it to human resources. He had simply gone back to work because the system needed him to, and because the system, at least, did not flinch when it saw him. At home, Carter lived with his daughter Matilda, who was 6 years old. Matilda's mother had died out of heart failure 3 years earlier on a quiet Tuesday afternoon at a hospital in the suburbs. Carter did not talk about that day. He talked about Matilda's homework, about her drawings, about the stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere because her mother had given it to her when she was 2. Every morning, Carter braided her coiled hair himself, slowly and carefully, because the smallest rituals were the things that held a small family together. He had learned every pattern from a video channel run by a hairstylist in Atlanta, and the first time he had finished a full braid without crying, Matilda had clapped from her booster seat and called him Daddy Stylist. The name had stuck. Matilda sometimes drew pictures of him with a blue shield over his shoulder. She called it her father's shield. He never asked her why. He kept those drawings inside a folder on the top shelf of the bookcase, where dust could not reach them. The apartment was small, but it was theirs. The South Side neighborhood was the kind of place where neighbors still knocked on each other's doors with a casserole when somebody had a hard week. Mrs. Harmon next door had been Matilda's after-school anchor since the funeral, and Carter paid her in coffee and quiet gratitude. There were no late-night colleagues to call. There was no extended team to lean on. There was a man, a child, and a stuffed rabbit with a re-stitched ear, holding the line together. 2 days before the defining morning, Carter stayed late at his desk and did something nobody had asked him to do. The dashboards looked normal. The automated systems were quiet, but something in his chest told him to look once more at the international authentication logs. He did not see a problem at first. He saw a rhythm. A small handful of requests appeared and reappeared at intervals, just irregular enough to slip past the automated filters. They did not fail. They did not trigger alarms. They were almost invisible. But Carter had spent 7 years listening to the system, and he heard the wrong note immediately. He pulled the raw logs into a side terminal and stripped away every familiar pattern, every routine handshake, every internal heartbeat the system used to confirm its own health. What was left was the rhythm, steady, patient, probing, the way a stranger walks the perimeter of a house at night, checking each window without ever touching one. He traced the rhythm back to a small authentication relay that the company had inherited during an acquisition 4 years earlier. The relay was supposed to handle a narrow set of cross-border verifications and nothing else, but because nobody had truly mapped the legacy system in years, that relay still had a quiet, indirect path into the core payment cluster. The path had been forgotten by everyone except whoever had finally found it. Someone with patience and skill had located the back door. They were not yet using it to steal. They were studying. They were learning the building before they decided how to break in. Carter pulled up the relay's original documentation and found a single page, undated, signed only with the initials of an engineer who had left the company before 2 of the current chief technology officers had even been hired. He called Corbin Pike, the head of operations. Corbin was 42, a middle manager who had survived 3 reorganizations by being very careful never to bring bad news upstairs. Carter explained what he had found and that the executive team should be informed. Corbin told Carter to keep watching. He said the new chief executive officer was about to walk in for her first week, and he did not want her first impression to include the words cyber attack. They needed more proof, Carter answered quietly. By the time we have the kind of proof you want, it will be too late. Corbin made a small sound that was almost a laugh and said, "You guys always see ghosts in the logs." Carter did not respond. He simply opened a private file on his terminal and logged the timestamp, the conversation, and the rejection underneath 6 previous escalations that had been suppressed in exactly the same way over the years. 6. He had counted. He could not shut the system off. He could not push the warning up the chain. He could only stay at his desk and start the work himself. The first night, he called Matilda over video. She was at the kitchen table with the neighbor, working on a math sheet. She asked when he was coming home, and he told her soon. He could not keep that promise. The second night, when he called, she was already in pajamas, holding the rabbit. She tilted her head toward the camera and asked, very softly, "Daddy, who are you saving?" He paused for a long moment. The question landed somewhere deep, in a place he had not let himself touch in 2 days. He told her finally that he was trying to make sure a lot of people did not lose money they could not afford to lose. Matilda thought about that. Then she said, "You can save them, Daddy." The connection ended a minute later. Carter sat in the blue light of his monitor and understood that he was not going to be allowed to sleep until this was finished. He could not shut the system down because transactions ran every second of every day. So he did the only thing he could do. He performed open-heart surgery on a beating heart. He rerouted suspicious traffic into an isolated observation zone, where it could move but could not touch anything that mattered. He added a second layer of authentication to the most sensitive endpoints, slipping the new checks underneath the existing logic so cleanly that the production system never noticed the change. He built false corridors, mirrored versions of the inner pathways, so the intruder, if they pushed forward, would believe they were progressing while actually being trapped inside a structure that led nowhere. Each corridor was designed to feel slightly different, with realistic latencies and plausible authentication echoes, so the intruder would never suspect they were being herded. He logged every move he made by hand in a long document on his personal terminal. He drew the isolation map on grid paper because the screens were too narrow to hold the whole shape of it. He named each false corridor after streets he had driven down with Matilda on Sunday mornings, just to keep himself oriented. He drank coffee that had gone cold 3 times. He ate half a sandwich at 3 in the morning because the sandwich had been there and his body had remembered it. The control room around him emptied and refilled and emptied again as shifts changed. Nobody asked what he was building. Nobody offered to help. The overnight engineers nodded at him on their way out and assumed, because he was still there, that somebody upstairs must have approved it. By the late hours of the second night, he had found the worst part. The intruder had planted a delayed trigger inside the core cluster. The trigger was not designed to break anything by itself. It was designed to wait. The moment somebody restarted the cluster in the normal way, the temporary defenses Carter had built would vanish from memory, and the trigger would unfold cleanly into a path that led straight from the legacy relay into the payment engine. Restart was the most ordinary command in the manual. Restart happened during regular maintenance, during patch deployments, during the small panic moments when a manager wanted to look decisive. That was what made it the perfect trap. Whoever had said it understood the rhythms of corporate panic better than they understood code, and that was the thing that frightened Carter most. He spent 2 hours trying to find a way to neutralize the trigger without a restart, and each path he tested ended in a different version of the same risk. He typed a message in large letters at the top of his notes. Do not restart the core cluster under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a planted attack. Call me first. He left his personal phone number underneath, and then he left a second copy of the same warning inside a folder on the shared drive where the on-call engineers would see it if they opened the runbook. He thought about emailing it to the executive distribution list. He thought about it for a long time, and then he decided to wait until morning, when he could deliver the warning in person to the new chief executive officer, with the full file open in front of her. His body had other ideas. The exhaustion came down on him in one slow wave at 5 in the morning, the kind of exhaustion that did not feel like sleep, but like a slow sinking through warm water. He told himself he would rest his eyes for 10 minutes. He did not get 10 minutes. 5 minutes before Serafina Whitlock walked through the door, Carter Hayes was unconscious at his desk. Serafina arrived earlier than her own schedule that morning. She did not want a curated tour. She did not want slide decks. She wanted to see how the company actually worked when no one was performing. With her walked Irene Caldwell, the head of human resources, a woman of 39 whose voice had been trained over many years to sound like a policy document. A security guard followed 2 steps behind because the new chief executive officer's first walk through the building had been planned by people who believed in optics. Their heels and shoes echoed across the lobby tile. Employees in the elevator straightened their collars when they recognized her. She returned each nod with the small, even smile she had practiced in business school. The smile that said, I am here, and I see you, and I will be deciding things shortly. She entered the operations center at 7:45. The room was full of cool white light. 2 banks of large monitors flashed amber and red. A handful of overnight engineers stood near the kitchenette finishing their handover, looking exhausted. At the central station, slumped forward over his keyboard, was Carter Hayes. His face was turned to one side against his forearm. He was breathing slowly. He had been asleep for less than 2 hours. A coffee cup sat empty by his elbow. A grid paper isolation map lay open beside his keyboard, every corridor labeled in his neat handwriting, but the angle of the light hit the paper in a way that turned the labels into shadow. Serafina did not see what was actually on the screens. She did not see the isolation maps, the rerouted traffic, the makeshift trap diagrams labeled in handwriting. She did not see the warning document in the shared folder. She saw a black man asleep at his desk. The image clicked into the story she had brought with her into that room. The story of a tired company full of tired habits that needed a strong hand to wake them up. There was something else in that story too, something she would not have named even to herself, a frame of assumption that traveled in front of her vision faster than her judgment could catch up to it. The brain decides things before the conscious mind is ever asked. She did not check. She did not ask. She decided. She said his name loud enough to fill the room. Carter Hayes. He jerked awake. For a moment his eyes did not focus. The sounds of the room came back to him slowly. Serafina did not lower her voice. Whitlock Pay does not pay people to sleep through the protection of our customer systems. Carter pushed himself up. He did not panic. He spoke immediately, because he had thought about how he would deliver this message for 2 nights. Ma'am, I need 3 minutes. There is a planted trigger in the core cluster. If anyone restarts that cluster, the temporary defenses I built will collapse, and the attacker will have a clean path. She cut him off, I am not interested in excuses on my first morning. She turned to Irene and told her to begin termination. The security guard stepped forward to collect Carter's badge. Carter tried again. Please, if anyone restarts that cluster, do not. Just call me first. She did not look at him. Behind her, Corbin Pike stood very still, his jaw set, because he understood that if Carter said one more sentence, his own role in the silence would be visible. Zane Holloway, 25, watched from his station. He did not speak. Carter unclipped his badge and laid it on the desk. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Zane and said, very clearly, do not restart the core cluster. Then he walked out of the building with the slow, steady gait of a man who had nothing left in his legs. The door closed behind him with a soft mechanical click that nobody in the room would forget for the rest of their careers. For nearly 4 hours, the system did not break. That was the cruelest part. Carter's temporary defenses were still active in memory, still steering bad traffic into the trap, still buying time. From the outside, everything looked normal. The dashboard stayed green. Every passing minute reinforced Serafina's confidence that her decision had been correct. She walked into her late morning meetings energized. She told the leadership team that Whitlock Pay would no longer be a place where old habits were tolerated. Irene Caldwell told her, in private, that the message had landed beautifully. Up on the executive floor, Serafina pulled up the dashboard one more time before her 11 o'clock and saw nothing but green. She thought, with a quiet satisfaction she would later remember in great detail, that this was the kind of morning her father had warned her about, the kind where being decisive looked like being right. Down on the operations floor, the mood was very different. The room had grown unusually quiet after Carter walked out. Engineers who had been on the floor for years kept glancing at the empty central station and then looking away again. A white engineer named Devon, who had worked beside Carter for 6 of those 7 years, leaned over Zane's shoulder around mid-morning and said very quietly, if it had been someone else asleep at that desk, she would have at least asked. The sentence dropped like a cold stone into water. Zane did not answer right away. Around them, 2 other engineers who had heard it kept their eyes on their screens, but the rhythm of their typing slowed. The room had finally heard out loud the thing that none of them had been brave enough to name at 7:45. Devon did not say it again. He did not have to. Some sentences only need to be spoken once before they begin echoing on their own. Zane opened the folder Carter had left behind. He saw the dense logs, the hand-drawn isolation maps, and the warning at the top in capital letters. Do not restart. He understood enough of it to be afraid, but not quite enough to feel certain. He hesitated, the way young engineers hesitate when they suspect they know more than the people above them. He looked again at the warning. He looked at Carter's personal phone number underneath it. He picked up his desk phone. He set it back down. He picked it up again. The dial tone hummed in his ear like a question he did not know how to answer. He thought about Devon's sentence from earlier that morning. He thought about the way the security guard had stepped forward to take the badge. He thought about how easily a room could agree on a thing that was not true, just because nobody wanted to be the first one to break the agreement. Then, a manager's voice called his name from across the floor, and his hand fell away from the receiver. At 11:58, Corbin Pike walked over to the central station with his sleeves rolled up. He looked at the slowing latency on a handful of queues and announced that they were going to restart the core cluster. Zane stood up. His voice cracked. Carter said not to restart. Corbin did not even turn around. Carter was just terminated. We do not run this company on warnings from people who lost their job this morning. It was the kind of sentence that, in its arrogance, captures the failure of an entire culture. The moment a person loses their title, their truth loses its weight. Zane looked across the room at Devon. Devon looked back at him. Neither of them said anything else. The restart command went in. For the first few minutes, the dashboards looked better. Latency improved. Some cues turned green. Corbin exhaled. It was the calm just before everything came apart. When the cluster came back up, Carter's temporary defenses dissolved out of memory, along with everything else that had been holding the line. The planted trigger waited a few minutes, just long enough to look innocent, and then it began to move. Authentication tokens started drifting out of step. Some transactions appeared in the system as if they had never been initiated, while their underlying instructions had already passed the first processing layer. Some high-value payments hung between 2 states, neither completed nor canceled, invisible to the reconciliation engine. A finance director from a regional hospital network called in around 12:30, asking why a vendor batch had not yet cleared, his voice already tight with the controlled panic that finance people learn how to wear. He was the first of 17 calls that would come in over the next 40 minutes. The intruder was not loud. There was no countdown clock, no ransom note. The danger was that the damage was technical and silent, and very difficult to explain to anyone who did not live inside the system. A portion of outbound traffic began to be rerouted toward an endpoint that was not on the company's verified network. Small test payments went first, then the larger ones followed. By a little after 1 in the afternoon, $420 million in transactions had either been routed incorrectly, frozen mid-process, or dropped out of the reconciliation engine entirely. That figure did not mean $420 million had been stolen outright. It meant that $420 million in customer money was, at that moment, in a state that the company could no longer fully see, fully verify, or fully guarantee. For a payment processor, that was almost worse than a clean theft. The chief technology officer began messaging Serafina. The chief risk officer began messaging the chief technology officer. Devin walked over to Zane's station and stood next to him without speaking. Zane was already opening Carter's folder again with shaking hands, this time to find the personal phone number written underneath the warning. He dialed. The call went through and rang. It rang for a long time. It rang into a quiet apartment on the south side, where the man it was trying to reach had finally fallen into the kind of sleep the body takes by force when the mind has refused for too long. At the south side apartment, Carter had made it as far as the couch and no farther. He had not taken off his shoes. His laptop was still inside his bag on the floor. Matilda was at the kitchen table when he came in, working on a math sheet weighed down by a salt shaker. She had run to him at the door, and he had picked her up, and then he had set her down very gently and told her he just needed to lie down for a few minutes. Mrs. Harmon had brought over a plate of sliced apples and gone home. Matilda climbed quietly onto the couch and pulled a thin blanket up over her father's shoulder. She added another small blue shield to the corner of her math sheet. Then she sat beside him and counted his breaths the way she would count the last raindrops at the end of a storm. She knew her father was fighting bad people. She did not understand all of it, but she understood enough to stay quiet and to let the phone in his bag keep ringing. Serafina's phone began to vibrate without stopping. The chief technology officer messaged her 3 times. "Operations needs you now." She excused herself from the strategy meeting with a smile that did not move correctly across her face, and she walked back down to the operations center for the second time that day. The room had transformed. The monitors were red. Engineers were speaking quickly to each other and to the phone in the same breath. Zane Holloway stood at his console, his face the color of old paper. Corbin Pike was trying to keep his voice level, but his hands were trembling. Devin caught Serafina's eye for a single moment, and then looked back at his screen, and in that 1/2 second, she understood something she had not had the words for an hour earlier. She asked the only question that mattered. "What is happening?" One of the older engineers, who had been with the company for 15 years, spoke without looking up from his screen. "It looks like Carter has been holding the system together by hand for the past 2 days. We just turned off everything he was doing." Those words landed in her chest like a stone in cold water. She did not respond. She did not have a response. She moved to Zane's station and asked to see Carter's notes. Zane opened the folder. She read the timeline. Anomalies detected. Reported to operations head. Request to escalate denied. Temporary defenses constructed. Restart trigger discovered. Warning, written. She read the last line. "If I am no longer in this building, do not restart the core cluster. Call me first." Underneath was a personal phone number. Nobody had called. She tried the number. It rang and rang. She tried again. She tried a 3rd time. She told Irene Caldwell to find his home address and to do it in the next 90 seconds. She drove there herself, alone, away from the glass towers of the financial district, into a part of the city she rarely had reason to visit. The streets grew narrower. The buildings became older. The south side passed her windows in the rhythm of a neighborhood that did not know she existed and did not need her to. Children rode bikes in the late afternoon light. A woman braided another woman's hair on a folding chair on the sidewalk. A young man in a delivery uniform raised a polite hand at her when she stopped at a four-way sign. 2 blocks later, an older man at a bus stop nodded at her car without surprise, as if women in business suits driving through this neighborhood was either nothing unusual or nothing he cared to question. With every block, a question she had never allowed herself to ask began to surface. What part of the story she had carried into that room this morning had been written before she ever laid eyes on him? She had no answer that did not make her face go hot, and the question kept asking itself the whole way down. She parked in front of a 4-story walk-up and walked up to the 3rd floor with her heels making far too much noise. She knocked. There was no answer. She knocked again, harder. The door opened just a crack. The chain still on. 2 large brown eyes looked up at her from below the level of the handle. The chain came off, and Matilda Hayes stood in the doorway in a soft cotton dress, holding a stuffed rabbit whose left ear had been carefully restitched at least twice. Matilda did not look afraid. She looked careful. "Are you here for my daddy?" Serafina's voice almost did not work. She had walked into that hallway expecting an angry man, possibly bitter. She had not prepared for a 6-year-old child polite enough to ask a question instead of shutting the door. "Yes," she said. "I need to speak with him. It is very important." Matilda stepped back to let her in. The apartment was small and clean. The kitchen had a box of cereal on the counter, a math sheet weighed down by a salt shaker. On the refrigerator was the drawing of a man with a blue shield, signed in a child's careful printing. There was a framed photograph on a low shelf of a woman, with kind eyes holding a baby. The light coming through the front window was the soft gold of early afternoon, and it caught the edges of everything in the room in a way that made the whole apartment feel like a place that had decided, against all odds, to keep itself together. A pair of small pink sneakers sat lined up neatly by the door. A library book about ocean animals lay open on the floor beside the couch. A man's tie hung from the back of a kitchen chair where he had left it 3 days ago, when he had no idea what kind of week was coming. Carter was on the couch. He had not made it under the blanket. One shoe was still on. His laptop sat closed on the floor beside him. Matilda whispered, "He has not really slept in 2 days. He told me there were bad people trying to take a lot of other people's money. He said when he was done he would sleep." Serafina sat down on the very edge of the armchair. She did not know what to say to a 6-year-old who had clearly been keeping watch. She finally managed, "Thank you for opening the door for me." Matilda considered this with the solemn courtesy of a small person who had been raised to consider things carefully. "You are welcome," she said. Then she went back to her father, sat at his feet, and held the rabbit against her chest. The carefully built version of Serafina that walked into glass towers and made decisions in seconds cracked in one quiet moment. The apartment was the apartment of a man who had been hand-carrying his entire life by himself for years. The single shoe, the drawing of the blue shield. The way Matilda had not flinched when a stranger appeared at the door, only assessed. She gently said his name. He did not stir. She said it again, a little louder. He came up out of the sleep slowly, like a swimmer surfacing from a deep dive. When his eyes settled on her, there was no anger there. It was something far harder to look at. There was the exhaustion of a man who had run out of room to be disappointed. And Serafina understood for the first time, sitting in that armchair, that the look in his eyes was not new today. It was the sum of 7 years of being glanced past, of being asked where the senior engineer sat, of being the last one in the room whose warnings were taken seriously. She did not waste his time. "I was wrong," she said. "I did not listen to you. They restarted the cluster. It is collapsing." He closed his eyes for one long second, then opened them. He did not ask why. He already knew why. He reached for his laptop, looked at it for less than a minute, and set it back down. The look on his face told her that the worst had happened, but that it could still be saved. He turned to Matilda first. He asked her if she had eaten lunch. She nodded. He asked if Mrs. Harmon next door was still home. She nodded again and lifted the rabbit slightly, as if waving for both of them. Carter almost smiled. Then he looked at Serafina. "I am coming back," he said, "not because you apologized, not because of your title. If that attack completes, real people are going to lose paychecks, hospital payments, supplier deposits. I am coming back for them. He stood up, bent down, and kissed the top of Matilda's head, and told her he would be home for dinner. When Carter walked back into the operations center, the room went quiet. It was the same room where, that very morning, he had been fired in front of all of them. Eyes that had carefully avoided him a few hours earlier now looked up at him, ashamed, hopeful, frightened. Zane Holloway stood up from the central chair before Carter even reached it. Irene Caldwell did not seem to know which direction to look. Corbin Pike took half a step back. Devon, who had said the cold sentence about asking, he met Carter's eyes for one long moment and gave a single small nod that contained an entire apology. Carter did not return it. He did not refuse it either. He simply walked past Devon and toward the central station, leaving the nod hanging in the air between them as something to be handled later. Carter did not say anything about the firing. He did not demand an apology. He did not raise his voice. He set his laptop down on the desk and asked, in a level tone, for his system access to be restored, for the current network map to be displayed, for a timeline of every command issued since he had left, for the list of stuck transactions, the outbound logs, the token states, and the suspected endpoint addresses. He listened in silence as the engineers reported. Zane confirmed the restart at 11:58. Another engineer reported that the rollback had failed. The chief technology officer admitted, with discomfort in his voice, that the legacy patch logic Carter had built was not fully documented anywhere. Carter sat with his eyes on the screen for about 8 long seconds without saying anything. Then he began to speak in short, exact sentences. One team would isolate the abnormal outbound connections, but they would not cut them off cleanly, because they needed the trail to remain intact for forensic work. Another team would build a mirror pathway so they could see exactly where the redirected data was attempting to land. A third would prepare a controlled failover for the highest value clients. The legal team would call the 3 largest customers with a tightly worded preliminary notice, honest enough not to be fraud, careful enough not to detonate every penalty clause in their contracts. Zane was given the job of documenting every command Carter issued in real time, so that the company would never again rely on the memory of a single person to keep its core alive. Within 90 minutes, the worst of the bleeding had been stopped. Stuck transactions were quarantined. 3 large outbound payments were caught seconds before they would have left for the wrong endpoint. The delayed trigger was disarmed through a precise sequence of changes at the authentication layer. $420 million was no longer drifting outside the company's reach. Serafina stood at the edge of the room and did not interrupt. She watched a kind of competence that no quarterly slide could measure. She watched the way other engineers leaned in when Carter spoke, the way they answered him faster than they had answered anyone else all morning, the way trust gathered around him in a room that had cast him out at sunrise. Every time Carter had a moment of stillness, his eyes drifted toward his phone. He was always thinking about Matilda. When the system was finally stable, the room let out a long exhale. Nobody cheered. The respect in the silence was heavier than any applause. Devon walked past the central station on his way to the break room and rested a hand briefly on Carter's shoulder. Carter did not look up, but he gave one small nod that said the apology had been received. The 2 men did not speak again that afternoon. They did not need to. Some things between coworkers are settled by the geometry of a hand on a shoulder and require no words at all. The board of directors met in emergency session that same evening. Archie Whitlock, Serafina's father, sat at the far end of the table, his face drawn and serious. The timeline was presented in dry sentences. Anomaly detected 48 hours earlier, reported to head of operations. Escalation denied. Warning written and posted. New chief executive officer terminated him before he could finish speaking. Restart subsequently authorized. Company exposure peaked at $420 million. Recovery led by the same engineer who had been terminated that morning. Serafina stood up. This morning, she said, I terminated Carter Hayes before I let him finish a single sentence. I saw an image that fit the story I wanted to tell, and I called it the truth. I was wrong. I owe Mr. Hayes a public apology because the firing was public. Corbin Pike was asked to leave the room pending an independent review. Irene Caldwell was tasked with rebuilding the emergency termination protocol. The board offered Carter reinstatement, a substantial bonus, an immediate raise, and a new title as Director of Infrastructure Security. He asked to speak first. Money mattered to him, he said, because he had a daughter to raise. But before they talked about money, he wanted to talk about structure. He laid down 3 conditions. The first was that any serious security warning from a frontline engineer must have a guaranteed direct path to executive leadership, with no middle manager allowed to quietly absorb a critical alert. The second was that no human being was ever again to become the single point of survival for the entire system. The third was that anyone who raised a credible risk inside the company, even one uncomfortable for senior leaders, would be protected in writing. Then he looked around the table and added one more line, very evenly. And this protection must apply doubly to engineers who already know what it feels like to be looked at twice before they are listened to once. The room went silent in a different way than it had been silent before. Archie Whitlock closed his eyes for one long second. Serafina lowered her gaze to the table. The whole room understood, in that quiet moment, that the man across from them had every kind of leverage to take revenge and was using it instead to build walls around the people who would come after him. Serafina accepted every condition without negotiating. A few months later, Whitlock Pay held an internal announcement to launch the Resilient Systems Initiative. The setting was deliberately not grand. Serafina took the podium first, in a simple charcoal suit. She told the room that the most expensive lesson of her early career had come on the morning she had walked into a control room, seen a man asleep at his desk, and assumed she already understood the entire story. "I was not just wrong about the system," she said. "I was wrong about him." Then she invited Carter Hayes to the podium. He came up not as the man who had been fired, but as the man who had finally been heard. He thanked Zane for bringing the notes into the light. He thanked Devon for the sentence that had broken the silence on the floor. In the front row, Matilda sat next to Archie Whitlock, holding the rabbit on her lap, watching her father with the kind of pride that does not need words. After the ceremony, Serafina walked over and knelt down at the little girl's eye level. She gave her a small enamel keychain shaped like a blue shield, made from the drawing on the refrigerator. Matilda clipped it to her backpack at once and pressed the shield with her thumb to make sure it was holding tight. Carter looked at Serafina, and for the first time since the morning he had been fired, allowed a small smile to settle on his face. There was no embrace. There was no declaration. There was only the recognition between two people who had once stood on opposite sides of a single mistake. Carter Hayes had been fired for falling asleep at work. The truth was that he had stayed awake longer than anyone in the building to protect people whose names he would never know. And Serafina Whitlock had learned that real leadership is not the speed of the order you give. It is the willingness to stop long enough to hear the person who is trying to save you.